She's just a silent doll, probably doesn't understand a single word of English, Lucas Bennett sneered, his voice slicing through the air with deliberate contempt. Ethan Marshall let out a short, arrogant laugh, the kind that echoed confidently across the private dining room of Aurora, where crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over polished ebony tables, where power and wealth mingled in every breath. In that moment, time seemed to freeze, the weight of their words hung heavy in the air, igniting a quiet fire inside those who bore witness. Before we dive into this story, take a second, hit subscribe, turn and like to support TH. Tonight's dinner marked a historic negotiation. Novogenics, one of America's leading biotech giants, was attempting to acquire Neurotech, a South Korean pioneer in AI-driven medical technology, valued at over $1.2 billion. Ethan Marshall, CEO of Novogenics, sat confidently, leaning back with icy blue eyes and a self-satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. Beside him was Lucas Bennett, Novogenics's young CFO, sporting a platinum watch that gleamed under the chandelier's light, swirling a glass of Bordeaux like a man who believed he owned the entire room. At the head of the table sat Ji-Yun Park, South Korean billionaire and CEO of Neurotech, her hands folded neatly atop the contract, her gaze stead. Grace Harper, a 25-year-old black waitress, moved gracefully between tables, a polished silver tray balanced effortlessly in her hands. Every step was measured, every motion professional, yet her deep brown eyes missed nothing. She heard their whispered insults, sensed the disdain hidden in their laughter, and noticed the faint tension in Ji-Yun's otherwise calm expression. Grace knew this silence all too well. Having lived in Busan for years, fluent in Korean, she understood better than anyone the cost of holding one's tongue. But tonight, she told herself she had to stay out of it. Aurora had strict rules. By the door stood Maya Torres, a young Latina receptionist, her sharp, watchful eyes quietly scanning the room. She exchanged a subtle glance with Grace, a silent acknowledgement between two women who understood exactly what was happening. Maya knew Ethan and Lucas well, their arrogance was nothing new, but tonight, their insults were crossing a line. Still, in a place like Aurora, where money dictated the rules, voices like Maya's or Grace's didn't matter. Manager Henry Walsh had repeated it endlessly, the guests pay. We serve. Lucas suddenly set his wine glass down and leaned toward Grace, his voice dripping with condescension. Hey, sweetheart, top up my Bordeaux, he said, without looking at her. Then, turning back to Ethan, he added with a smirk, and look at her, Ethan, probably just nods like some outdated robot, right? His laughter erupted again, bouncing off the dark wood walls. The room felt heavier, the air thicker. Ji-Yun didn't respond, didn't flinch, only tilted her head slightly, her gaze briefly meeting Grace's. There was something unspoken there, something more than endurance, something deeper. Grace's heartbeat quickened. She knew that feeling, the sting of being dismissed, belittled, diminished for your skin, your gender, your origins. Suddenly, memories of Busan flooded back. The vibrant alleys of Gukch Market, the sweet smell of hotteok pancakes, the warmth of Chuseok nights where Korean families welcomed her like their own, teaching her language, customs, and belonging. In Busan, she was never different. But after returning to the US, everything changed. People laughed when they learned she spoke Korean. A black girl speaking Korean? That's hilarious. They thought it was a compliment. To Grace, it was a label, a reminder that she didn't fit anywhere. And so, she learned to hide that part of herself. Tonight, she planned to keep it hidden. But Lucas's next words froze her in place. Honestly, Ethan, I don't get why we're dropping $1 billion on a company whose CEO is basically an outdated AI program. Sign the contract, and we'll own everything she's built. Grace's grip on the silver tray tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her breath caught, and then, for the first time that evening, she heard Ji-Yun's voice. It was quiet, low, and in flawless Korean. Is there anyone here who truly sees me? Grace's heart clenched. The words were soft as a sigh, but they shattered the fragile wall of silence. For the briefest moment, Ji-yun's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them: recognition, solidarity, pain understood without explanation. Maya, standing by the door, caught the exchange and gave Grace the smallest nod, as though urging her forward. The insults kept coming. Ethan and Lucas laughed carelessly, slicing through the air like knives. But something had shifted inside Grace. This wasn't just about Ji-yun anymore. This was about every time she'd been overlooked, every time she'd been silenced, every time she'd swallowed tears just to keep her job. Quietly, Maya lifted her phone, recording everything. She sensed tonight would require proof. Outside the glass door, Henry Walsh glanced inside, his warning clear in his sharp gaze. But tonight, something was changing. There was a current in the room, rising beneath the surface, pulling Grace toward a choice she could no longer avoid. Ji-yun remained silent, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were razor-sharp, watching every move, absorbing every detail. She wasn't weak. Her silence was strategy, not submission. But Grace knew this much: if no one stood up tonight, this deal would strip Ji-yun of everything she'd built. Her lips trembled as she took a steadying breath. Ethan's words echoed in her head like a hammer: "We'll take her entire team." Grace's fingers clenched around the white napkin in her hand, her gaze locking on Ji-yun. And in that moment, she knew, her silence wouldn't save anyone. The soft clink of a spoon against crystal cut through the tense air. Grace set her tray down gently and took one measured step toward the head of the table. The entire room stilled. Ethan raised a brow, Lucas tilted his head, annoyance flashing across his face. But before either man could speak, Grace bowed deeply, a respectful, deliberate gesture she'd learned in Busan, and spoke, her voice calm yet unwavering, in flawless Korean. "Ms. Park, I apologize for the disrespect you've endured tonight." For one suspended heartbeat, silence consumed the room. Then Ethan glanced at Lucas, Lucas stared back at Ethan, both frozen, their arrogance unraveling in real time. No one could believe what had just happened. And in that instant, everything changed. The entire room was frozen, the weight of Grace's words hanging heavy in the air. For the first time all evening, Ji-yun Park's expression shifted ever so slightly, her gaze softened, and the faintest glimmer of gratitude passed across her eyes. Ethan Marshall leaned back in his chair, his smirk faltering, while Lucas Bennett's jaw clenched tight, his arrogance slowly draining away. The balance of power had tilted, though no one could yet comprehend just how far it would fall. But Grace Harper understood. Her voice, steady and calm, had pierced through walls built on pride, greed, and prejudice. And yet, she also knew this was only the beginning. Ji-yun's silence was not weakness. It was a weapon, one she had wielded her entire life. Tonight, Grace would learn just how powerful that silence could be. Grace stood motionless, head bowed slightly, unsure if she had just crossed a line she couldn't return from. Her chest rose and fell, her heart thundering beneath her uniform. She expected Henry Walsh, Aurora's controlling manager, to storm in at any second and fire her on the spot. But instead, she felt something unexpected: calm. It was as if a decision had been made deep within her before she even realized it herself. She wasn't just defending Ji-yun Park. She was defending herself, her dignity, her right to exist without being made small. Ji-yun finally spoke, softly, her Korean melodic and deliberate. "Thank you." The single word was quiet, yet it echoed through the silence like a bell. Grace's eyes lifted just slightly, meeting Ji-yun's gaze, and in that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them: recognition. Ji-yun had been underestimated her entire life, and she could see the same scars written in Grace's eyes. Lucas broke the silence first, his voice cutting sharp and cold. "Excuse me, what the hell is going on here? Ethan, are we seriously letting a waitress interfere in a $1 billion deal?" He scoffed, trying to reclaim control, swirling the last of his wine as if mocking the very gravity of the situation. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice low, controlled, but beneath the surface, there was an edge of warning. "Ms. Park," he said smoothly, "I think we should proceed with business, yes? No need to complicate things with unnecessary drama." Ji-Yun didn't respond. She remained still, poised, composed. That silence unsettled Ethan far more than any outburst would have. It was the kind of silence that stripped away facades and forced men like him to confront themselves. Grace knew exactly what Ji-Yun was doing. She had seen that same quiet resilience in countless women who had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. This was no surrender. This was strategy. Maya Torres, standing quietly by the door, sensed the shift as well. She pulled out her phone, pretending to check messages but quietly opening the recording app again, capturing every word, every insult, every manipulation. She knew instinctively this was bigger than tonight, bigger than Aurora, bigger even than Grace and Ji-Yun. This was about exposing an entire system that thrived on silence, the kind of silence they now intended to break. Ethan gestured to the contract lying flat on the polished ebony table. "Let's not waste any more time," he said, his tone smooth but laced with impatience. "The deal terms are generous, Ms. Park. You'll find everything you need in black and white." Lucas smirked, leaning back lazily in his chair. "Assuming, of course, she understands what she's signing," he muttered under his breath, his arrogance bleeding into every syllable. Grace's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She glanced down at the document, noticing several key clauses highlighted in faint blue ink, clauses Ethan and Lucas clearly hoped would slip by unnoticed. But Grace had spent her childhood watching her mother, a diplomat, review complex international agreements late into the night. She had learned early on to read between the lines, to spot the traps hidden beneath elegant language. And what she saw now made her blood run cold. The contract wasn't just unfavorable, it was predatory. One clause allowed Novogenics full rights to Neuroteca's AI technology, including exclusive patents, without Ji-Yun's consent. Another included a non-compete agreement that would effectively bar Ji-Yun from working in the tech industry for 15 years. And buried deep in the final pages was a provision that gave Novogenics the power to dissolve Neuroteca's executive team, every engineer, every innovator, every dream Ji-Yun had built, all within 60 days of signing. Grace looked up slowly, her expression steady, but her voice firm. "Ms. Park," she said in Korean, clear and deliberate. "This contract is designed to steal your company." The room went silent again. Ethan's expression hardened, his polished mask beginning to crack, while Lucas slammed his palm against the table. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his composure unraveling. "She's a waitress. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But Ji-Yun was no longer silent. Turning to Grace, she said calmly in English for the first time that evening, her voice smooth and confident, "Show me." Grace stepped forward, pointing to each clause carefully, explaining its implications with precision, weaving her words between English and Korean to ensure Ji-Yun understood every nuance. Ji-Yun followed closely, her sharp mind absorbing each detail. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance faltering as the trap they'd set began to unravel in front of them. Maya, unable to stay silent any longer, stepped closer to the table and whispered to Grace, slipping her phone discreetly into her hand. "I recorded everything," she murmured. Grace glanced down, the screen displayed a clear audio file capturing Lucas's earlier words, "She won't understand. Push the contract through, and we'll take her entire team." Grace pressed play. The sound of Lucas's voice filled the room, his words cold, calculated, undeniable. Ethan's face drained of color as Ji-Yun's sharp gaze locked on him, unblinking, unyielding. Lucas reached out as if to grab the phone, but Ji-Yun raised her hand slightly, halting him without saying a word. From the doorway, Henry Walsh finally stepped inside, his face flushed with anger. "Grace Harper," he barked, his voice booming across the room, "You are done here. Pack your things. You're fired." Before Grace could respond, Ji-yeon turned her chair slowly, facing Henry directly. Her voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the tension. "She's not going anywhere." The authority in her tone stunned everyone, including Ethan and Lucas. Henry opened his mouth to protest but faltered under Ji-yeon's piercing stare. In that moment, it was clear who truly held the power in the room. Grace exhaled, steadying her hands as she set the phone on the table. Ji-yeon leaned back, folding her arms, and for the first time all night, she smiled, faint, deliberate, victorious. Ethan's jaw tightened. Lucas's smirk had completely vanished. What they thought was going to be an easy victory had turned into something far more dangerous. Grace had done more than speak. She had shifted the balance of power. And for the first time, Ji-yeon Park, silent no longer, was ready to take control of her narrative. But Grace didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. This wasn't over. There would be consequences. Ethan and Lucas weren't the type to surrender quietly. And somewhere deep down, Grace sensed this confrontation was about to escalate far beyond the walls of Aurora's private dining room. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't fragile or fearful. It was loaded, charged, like the air before a storm. And as Ji-yeon closed the contract folder with deliberate calm, one thought burned bright in Grace's mind: tonight, the quiet ones were finally being heard. The air inside Aurora's private dining room had shifted completely. The balance of power no longer rested with Ethan Marshall and Lucas Bennett, but neither of them seemed ready to accept it. Grace Harper stood near the head of the table, her silver tray now resting silently on a nearby counter, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Her act of courage had already changed the course of the evening, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. For the first time, Ji-yeon Park turned her full attention to Ethan and Lucas, her expression calm yet unyielding. Her silence had been her armor, but now she was ready to wield it like a blade. Lucas broke first, slamming his palm flat against the table. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of frustration. "Ethan, are we seriously letting a waitress derail a billion-dollar negotiation? This is insulting." He turned sharply toward Grace, his blue eyes burning with anger. "You've overstepped your place, sweetheart. You should walk away while you still have a job." Grace didn't flinch. She met his glare with quiet steadiness, her voice calm but laced with conviction. "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "my place tonight is where the truth is. And the truth is in those documents." Her hand gestured subtly toward the contract lying open on the polished ebony table. The faint highlight marks she had pointed out earlier were still visible under the soft chandelier light, silent evidence of a trap meticulously designed to strip Ji-yeon of everything she had built. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table's edge. His polished confidence was beginning to fray. "Ms. Park," he began, his voice smooth but strained, "I think we're letting emotions get in the way of business. This acquisition is good for both of us. You'll walk away wealthier than you've ever been, and Novogenics will ensure Neuroteca's innovations reach a global audience." Ji-yeon remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Ethan, unblinking. She didn't interrupt. She didn't respond. She simply watched. And that silence, deliberate, calculated, impenetrable, unsettled Ethan more than any argument could have. For years, Ji-yeon had endured boardrooms filled with men just like him, men who underestimated her, men who mistook quiet for weakness. But tonight, her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She was letting them reveal who they really were. Lucas scoffed, breaking the tension. "For crying out loud," he muttered, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed defensively. "This entire deal has been more trouble than it's worth. Ethan, let's just table this and come back when Ms. Park decides she's actually ready to talk business." Grace stepped forward slightly, her voice clear and steady as she switched to Korean, speaking directly to Ji-yun. "Ms. Park, this contract was designed to take your company. They do not respect you." Ji-yun's lips curved almost imperceptibly at the edges, the smallest sign of acknowledgement. For the first time, she replied in Korean as well, her voice soft but resolute. "I know. But the fight is just beginning." Those words rippled through Grace like electricity. She realized in that moment that Ji-yun wasn't afraid. She had been waiting, watching, calculating, choosing her moment carefully. And now, with Grace by her side, that moment had arrived. Ethan's composure finally cracked. He leaned forward, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "Let me be very clear," he said, his words cold, deliberate. "Novogenics holds the funding leverage here. If this deal falls apart, Neuroteca's valuation will plummet overnight. Investors will walk. Banks will follow. And when they do, Ms. Park, your company won't survive 6 months." Ji-yun didn't flinch. Instead, she turned slowly to Grace and spoke softly, still in Korean, ensuring Ethan and Lucas couldn't understand. "They use threats as weapons. But we have proof." At that precise moment, Maya Torres stepped forward from the doorway, holding up her phone with both hands. "Actually," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "we do." With one tap, she played back the recording, Lucas's voice, crystal clear and damning, "She won't understand. Push the contract through, and we'll take her entire team." The words filled the room like a thunderclap. Ethan froze, his jaw tightening, while Lucas's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. Ji-yun turned her gaze slowly toward them, her expression unreadable, yet her silence spoke volumes. Henry Walsh, the Aurora manager, stormed in at that moment, his voice booming. "Grace Harper," he barked, his face flushed, "you're finished here. Pack your things and leave immediately." Grace inhaled sharply but said nothing. She didn't have to. Ji-yun finally broke her silence, turning to Henry with a calm but commanding tone, "She's not leaving." The authority in her voice was so absolute, so steady, that Henry's bluster collapsed instantly. He hesitated, his mouth opening to argue, but one sharp look from Ji-yun stopped him cold. Lucas, seething, leaned toward Ethan. "We can still fix this," he hissed under his breath. "We spin it, bury the recording, threaten legal action," but Ethan raised a hand, silencing him, his sharp mind already calculating damage control. For the first time tonight, he understood the danger they were in. Ji-yun rose slowly from her seat, pushing her chair back with deliberate grace. The sound echoed in the tense silence, like the striking of a match before an explosion. "Mr. Marshall," she said evenly, her voice calm yet unwavering, "this deal is no longer on the table. Neurotech does not partner with those who operate without integrity." Ethan's face drained of color. Lucas started to protest, but Ji-yun cut him off with a single, piercing look, the kind that left no room for negotiation. Grace's hands trembled slightly, adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she stood taller than she ever had in her life. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't silent. And neither was Ji-yun. Maya slipped quietly to Grace's side, whispering softly, "I uploaded the recording to a secure drive, just in case." Grace gave her a grateful glance. They both knew this was no longer just about tonight. This was bigger than Aurora, bigger than Neurotech, bigger than Novogenics. It was about exposing how power was abused behind closed doors, and making sure people like Ethan and Lucas could never hide in the shadows again. The room was quiet, but the silence was no longer fragile. It was charged, dangerous, alive. Ji-yun glanced at Grace one last time and nodded subtly, as if to say, "We're not done yet." And deep in her gut, Grace knew she was right. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The tension inside Aurora's private dining room was unbearable, the billion-dollar contract lying open on the ebony table with its hidden traps now fully exposed, while Ethan Marshall sat stiff and silent, his polished confidence cracked, and Lucas Bennett fidgeted beside him, his earlier arrogance drained away. Ji-Yeon Park stood calm and composed, her quiet presence radiating more power than words ever could, while Grace Harper remained near her, heart pounding, palms damp, still unable to believe what she had just done, and Maya Torres by the door kept her phone ready, knowing the recording she held could change everything. Suddenly the door opened and Malik Carter entered, his tailored navy suit sharp, his presence commanding immediate authority as executive director of Pacific Innovation Fund and one of Neuroteca's largest investors, his deep voice steady and controlled as he said, "I've reviewed the footage. Aurora's security cameras recorded everything," while his piercing gaze moved from Ji-Yeon to Ethan and Lucas before resting briefly on Grace, and Lucas, trying to recover his composure, forced out a nervous laugh. "Malik, this is all a misunderstanding." Emotions got heated but only for Malik to silence him with a single raised hand, tapping the sleek tablet in his grip so that Lucas's own damning words filled the room. "She won't understand. Push the contract through, and we'll take her entire team," the recording echoing like thunder as Lucas paled and Ethan's jaw tightened. Malik turned sharply to Henry Walsh, Aurora's manager, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Walsh, you owe Ms. Harper an apology," and Henry, visibly thrown, stammered, "But she," before Malik cut him off, his tone like steel, "she protected a billion-dollar partnership with more integrity than anyone in this room. You should be thanking her," forcing Henry, red-faced and reluctant, to turn to Grace and mutter, "Ms. Harper, I apologize," leaving Grace stunned, whispering a quiet, "Thank you," as Ji-Yeon gave her a faint, approving smile. Malik then stepped closer to Ji-Yeon, his voice respectful yet resolute. "Pacific Innovation stands behind you, Ms. Park, you're not fighting this alone," prompting Ji-Yeon to finally speak clearly in English, her voice soft yet commanding. "Thank you, Malik, but tonight's hero isn't me," as she turned toward Grace, locking eyes with her, "It's you," making Grace freeze as Ji-Yeon reached into her elegant clutch, pulling out a sleek silver business card and placing it gently into Grace's trembling hand, saying, "Ms. Harper, I'd like to offer you a position on Neuroteca's global strategy team, full scholarship for graduate studies, housing in Seattle, and a salary that matches your value," leaving Grace speechless until Ji-Yeon added warmly, "Say yes," and from the corner Maya smiled proudly, setting her phone on the table and saying softly, "The recordings are secured, Neuroteca's legal team already has copies." While across the table Lucas muttered under his breath, seething, only for Malik to shoot him a sharp glance and warn coldly, "Don't," silencing him instantly as Ethan sighed heavily, drained his glass, and muttered bitterly, "This isn't over," though deep down they both knew it was. By the next morning, Novagenix's board called an emergency meeting. Ethan was forced to resign. Lucas followed citing personal reasons. And headlines exploded nationwide, from Waitress to Hero, Black Woman Stops Billion-Dollar Betrayal, while social media lit up with clips of Grace speaking fluent Korean, millions praising her courage, dignity, and composure, and as Grace returned home clutching Ji-Yeon's business card close to her chest, she realized her life had changed forever. She was no longer invisible, no longer silent, and as Ji-Yeon and Malik left Aurora beneath Seattle's glowing skyline, Grace understood this victory wasn't just Ji-Yeon's, it was theirs, and it was only the beginning. Weeks after that unforgettable night at Aurora, Grace Harper's life had completely transformed. What began as an ordinary shift in a private dining room had turned into a story that captured national headlines and inspired millions. News outlets praised her as the woman who stopped a billion-dollar betrayal with nothing but courage and conviction. On social media, clips of Grace speaking fluent Korean to Ji-Yeon Park went viral, amassing millions of views and sparking conversations about dignity, respect, and hidden talent in workplaces. Strangers began calling her the quiet hero, and for the first time in her life, Grace felt truly seen. Neurotech officially announced Grace's appointment to its global strategy team just 1 week later. Alongside the position came a full scholarship for graduate studies, a modern apartment in downtown Seattle, and a salary that was beyond anything Grace had imagined. But for her, the real transformation wasn't about money or status. It was about finally being valued for who she was, her intelligence, her voice, and her courage. Ji-Yun Park became more than a CEO to her, she became a mentor and ally, helping Grace navigate high-level boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made. Through Ji-Yun, Grace learned the power of strategic silence, of measured words, and of holding your ground without raising your voice. With time, she blossomed into someone who could sit at the table as an equal, speaking confidently among investors and executives who once would have overlooked her entirely. Maya Torres's life also changed forever. Leaving Aurora behind, she joined Neuroteca's Ethics and Compliance Division at Ji-Yun's invitation. The woman who once stood quietly in the corner of the dining room now led efforts to ensure fairness and transparency across Neuroteca's global partnerships. Together, Grace and Maya became symbols of integrity, proving that even those dismissed as invisible could reshape the rules of power when given the chance. The ripple effects of that night spread far beyond Neurotech. Maya's recordings and Malik Carter's intervention triggered an SEC investigation into Novogenics, exposing predatory acquisition practices and unethical manipulation of contracts. Within weeks, Novogenics faced millions in federal fines. Ethan Marshall was forced to resign in disgrace, and Lucas Bennett was barred from holding any executive or board positions for the next decade. Across Silicon Valley and beyond, other companies scrambled to audit their acquisition strategies and compliance policies, desperate to avoid becoming the next headline. Industry insiders began referring to the shift as the Aurora Protocol, a movement prioritizing ethics, transparency, and mutual respect in high-stakes negotiations. Inside Neurotech, Ji-Yun Park launched the Grace Initiative, a company-wide program dedicated to identifying, mentoring, and empowering overlooked talent. The initiative offered scholarships, leadership training, language programs, and global exchange opportunities. Grace became its public ambassador, sharing her story at conferences, corporate summits, and leadership workshops. Her quiet courage inspired thousands, especially young professionals who had been made to feel invisible in workplaces that undervalued them. "I hid who I was for years," Grace said during one keynote speech, her voice steady but emotional. "But the night I chose to speak changed everything, not just for me, but for those who came after me." Beyond Neurotech, Ji-Yun used her influence to advocate for systemic reform across the tech industry. Partnering with Malik Carter, she created a global investment fund supporting startups founded by women, immigrants, and people of color, channeling millions into underrepresented innovators who had long been excluded from opportunities. Within a year, Neurotech became the leading voice in advancing diversity, inclusion, and workplace equity, setting a precedent other corporations were pressured to follow. For Grace, the transition into her new life was overwhelming at first. She went from pouring wine in silence to sitting across from international leaders and CEOs, from hiding her Korean fluency to using it as a bridge connecting cultures and opening doors for global partnerships. Yet she never forgot where she came from, the quiet strength it took to survive, the small acts of dignity she fought to preserve when no one noticed. Ji-Yun often reminded her, "Strength isn't always loud, Grace. It's knowing when to speak, and when to let silence speak for you." Months later, Grace stood on the rooftop terrace of Neuroteca's Seattle headquarters, overlooking Puget Sound as the sun dipped low, painting the city skyline in golden light. Beside her stood Ji-Yun, serene and composed, Malik Carter, ever strategic, and Maya, smiling proudly. They had built more than a team, they had created a movement. Grace thought back to that night at Aurora, the whispered insults, the quiet humiliation, the weight of choosing whether to remain invisible or step into the storm. That night had started with arrogance, prejudice, and manipulation but ended with solidarity, empowerment, and hope. The story spread beyond business circles, becoming a reminder shared in classrooms, boardrooms, and leadership seminars. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Because sometimes, the person clearing your table, standing silently in the corner, or quietly watching from the sidelines carries the power to change everything. For Grace Harper, that power had been inside her all along. And now, with her voice, her platform, and her courage, she was determined to use it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. That night at Aurora was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of a legacy. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us.